Kunja Vihari. Gopi Janavalava Girivaradari. Yashodanandana Vraja Janaranjana. Yashodanandana Vraja Janaranjana. Jamuna Tira Vanachari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari. Jai Om Vishnupad Paramahansa Parivrajacharya Astotra Sata Sri Srimad Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Jai Nitai Gaur Sitanath Premanandi Hari Hari Bol. So do you want this? Because I actually don't need it because I have Srimad computer. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So, we're on probably maybe the most famous chapter in the whole Bhagavatam. Plus, arguably, it would be Divinity and Divine Service. And we're on text 10. Kamasya Nendriya Pritir Labdho Jivera Javata Jivasya Tattva Jignasa Narto Yascheta Karma Bi Kamasya Nendriya Pritir Labdho Jiveta Yavata Jivasya Tattva Jignasa Narto Yascheta Karma Bi Karmasya Nendriya Pritir Yavo Jiveta Yavata Jivasya Tattva Jignasa Narto Yascheta Karma Bi Karmasya Nendriya Pritir Avojiveta Yavata Jivasya Tattva Jignasa Narto Yascheta Karma Bi Karmasya Nendriya Pritir Avojiveta Yavata Tattva Jignasa Narto Yascheta Karma Bi Karmasya Nendriya Pritir Avojiveta Yavata Jivasya Tattva Jignasa Narto Yascheta Karma Bi. So karmasya means of desires, right? Because you know the word kama. Na means not. Indriya, I think we also know. These are all pretty simple words that we are familiar with, right? Indriya means senses, and priti can mean many things, but here it means satisfaction. Labha means to acquire or to gain. Jiveta, self-preservation. And yavata, so much so. Jivasya, of the living being. Tattva, the absolute truth. Jignasa, inquiries. Like, what's that? The first verse of the Vedanta Sutra? Tato Brahma Jigyasa, right? Now that you have a human form, inquire. So Jigyasa, same word here. Na means not. Artha, here Prabhupada calls it end, right? We also mean, how do we usually translate artha? Valuable, yeah, acquire, right? So maybe, the goal is valuable, so the end here. Yacha iha, whatsoever else, and karma be, by occupational activities. Is everyone comfortable? We have 3 empty chairs there. Neat. Okay, so Srila Prabhupada's translation and his Bhaktivedanta purport. Life's desires should never be directed towards sense gratification. One should desire only a healthy life or self-preservation, since a human being is meant for inquiry about the absolute truth. Nothing else should be the goal of one's work. Prabhupada writes, the completely bewildered. That's quite a statement, isn't it? Sometimes Prabhupada speaks very in hyperbole, the completely bewildered material civilization is not that he's exaggerating, he just speaks in very absolute terms. The completely bewildered material civilization is wrongly directed towards the fulfillment of desires in sense gratification. In such civilization, in all spheres of life, the ultimate end is sense gratification. So that, I'll talk about these things later, but it's an important point to understand, because sometimes when we think of sense gratification, we only think of, maybe the regulated principles, right? Going out into McDonald's or illicit activities or intoxication. But here it's more generalized, all spheres of life. So even someone who's very pious and listens to classical music and all that kind of, there's still some, not pretty much anything except acting for God's pleasure is sense gratification. So that's why here Srila Prabhupada is making it more of a, therefore he says the ultimate end, sense gratification. Then he says in politics, social service, altruism. What does altruism mean? Usually when, has Vaisheshika Prabhu been here? Usually ask someone to have a phone with them to look up words. Altruism, what does that mean exactly? Doing good for others? Okay. So in politics, social service, altruism, philanthropy, because that philanthropy also, well, I guess it's similar to doing good to others, but right, yeah. And ultimately in religion or even in salvation, right? What Sanskrit word are we thinking of when we think of salvation? Moksha, mukti, yes. The very same tint of sense gratification is ever increasingly prominent, right? So even it could be a tint, right? Just like in, I have a friend who, actually the father of the young lady devotee who my son is marrying is an optometrist, right? So there's different tints that you have on your glasses, right? Some of them can be very light tints, right? Just a little, and then some of them can be sunglasses, right? Very strong tints. So here, Prabhupada says the very same tint of sense gratification is ever increasingly prominent. So it can be, like in politics, quite a dark sunglasses, right? Or even desiring moksha, just a little tint on the glasses, right? But it's still a tint. In the political field, the leaders of men fight with one another to fulfill their personal sense gratification. The voters adore the so-called leaders only when they promise sense gratification, as soon as the voters are dissatisfied in their own sense satisfaction, they dethrone the leaders. The leaders must always disappoint the voters by not satisfying their senses. The same is applicable in all other fields. No one is serious about the problems of life. Well, we can go slowly over this purport. Om Jnana Timirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. So, this point, right, about the voters adore the so-called leaders only when they promise sense gratification. So, and then he says, and as soon as the voters are dissatisfied with their own sense satisfaction, even though this is quite loud, I'm just used to it being closer, okay. They dethrone the leaders, right? So like they have polls all the time. Sometimes they come out with a poll every 2 weeks, right, or every month. And it's like people are so chanchala that they keep on changing, right? Could you imagine if there was a poll about Lord Ram by the residents of Ayodhya? And first of all, he'd probably score like 99% or 100. But could you imagine it changing like every week, right? Or Maharaj Yudhisthira, right? We are so fickle in this day and age, right? That and as Srila Prabhupada so rightly says, what do people base their liking or disliking a leader on? Sounds kind of, but specifically, because you don't see in the Chicago Tribune, people don't like Trump this week because he didn't give them sense gratification, right? They don't use those words. What words do they use? Facilities. Economics is a big one, right? Right? People have jobs, and the market is doing well, and things like that. And that is sense, right? Dharma, artha, right? That's artha. And that, because from artha you get kama, right? Yeah, so dharma, artha. So that's one thing. I'd say also, like we were talking about yesterday, about the idea of false ego and this impression we have of ourselves, and then we accept and reject according to, the mind accepts and rejects according to how much it protects our false ego, right? So in this case, we see, especially in politics today in America, and also in India, to a large extent with Prime Minister Modi, and in many parts of the world, that people will like someone because they reinforce their sense of themselves, their identity, right? Otherwise, it's pretty amazing in a place like America today, that a real estate guy from New York, of all places, can win the votes of people in Iowa and Nebraska and these places that generally don't like New Yorkers very much. But because he speaks in such a way that reinforces their false ego, right? Yeah, the government stinks. Yeah, those people are terrible, And he speaks in a rough way. Some people like that, right? And so it reinforces their false ego. And so that's a more subtle kind of sense gratification, right? So there's a very gross one. There's the pretty gross one of, the economy's doing well, the market's doing well. I have a good job. What's there to worry about, right? It's okay. But it works well even as it is, right? You can hear me fine, so it's actually good. I'm just used to it. Most temples don't have as good a program as you have. This is better actually because it's out of the way. Yeah. So what Prabhupada is saying here is so true, right? The voters adore the so-called leaders only when they promise sense gratification, right? And again, we've seen, like in President Trump, he's promising both. It's a little subtle, right? That make America great again. That right, and also kind of like just all those bozo liberals, right? And people love that kind of, right? and also the economy is doing well and things like that. So, but if the economy starts tanking, as soon as the voters are dissatisfied in their own sense satisfaction, they dethrone the leader. Right? Does this keep going down? It keeps. Is it me or? Oh, okay. So if it starts there, it'll come down. Yeah. All right. Is that okay? Yeah. They dethrone the leaders. The leaders must always disappoint the voters by not satisfying their senses. The same is applicable in all other fields. No one is serious about the problems of life. So their pleasure or displeasure with the leader is so much self-centered, right? And they're not so much of this in this first canto, especially the first canto, also the fourth canto. There's so much about the proper leaders, right? There's so much in the later chapters, 15, 16, like that. There's so much about it, and it's so much based on character, right? It's so much based on character. And so from a devotee point of view, I think it's usually a good idea, not for temples and things, not to get very involved in politics. We like Democrats, we like Republicans. We were always surprised that the political leanings of our congregation in D.C. They're all over the map, from this to this. So no need to. But we can say, the one concern at least that we can say about someone like President Trump is his character, right? And that's not saying that Clinton had a good character or I'm not, but it's so clear with him, right? And so we base not so much on policies and this and that, but it's gone down already. A leader is supposed to set the example in terms of character, right? And that's why Yudhisthira, what was the name for Yudhisthira? Dharmaraj, yes, right, Dharmaraj. And also, and he was referred to as Ajata Shatru, right? When his enemy was there, so he had all these saintly qualities. So people look up to someone like that, right? And that wouldn't it be so nice to have a president who was like, Paka, followed the 4 regulative principles, and and all such things. It would be, we would all be like, yeah, Haribo, we'd go to his praise and everything, right? Because you want to see a leader like that. And here, Prabhupada is talking about what really happens, and I think maybe it doesn't come up in this, but really the politicians become a servant of the masses, right? Because they have to say, please vote for me, right? I'll say anything if I can get you to vote for me, right? Like that. So it's a so that's our take on politics. I think that's the best thing is that we just hope that leaders can set a good example of piety and protecting Dharma, without getting into Republicans and Democrats and this and that. And it's actually tricky, I find, for devotees because if we're talking practically, that it's there it goes. That on one hand, we kind of appreciate the Republicans, right? Because they usually are against abortion and things like that, right? So sometimes from a moral point of view, but on the other hand, usually people who vote Democratic are usually more interested in Krishna consciousness. As a general rule, they're more liberal-minded. They're more into especially the Western group. They're more into, well, yeah, sure. Others, the Republicans will like, I go to church, bus, right? But the Democrats will do yoga and this and that. So we're kind of like torn, So the best thing is usually just stay out of politics and just talk about Krishna and talk about the ideal without mentioning anyone's name. So my point about President Trump was not, it was only about pious that leaders should be pious, not about him in particular. Yeah. Any thoughts on this so far? Comments, questions? Yes, Prabhu. Oh, only because okay, well, you'd have to ask him why he wrote that, not at me. But yeah, my technique. Because ultimately, you can't. How can you satisfy? Like, how many people are in America? About 370 million. Yeah, give or take a million or two. Can we really satisfy their senses? Right? Even Prime Minister Modi, right? When he first became elected, everyone was like, he really was very, very popular, right? Now the election's going on, and he's going to win. Is that right? You think? Right? But even people who were kind of staunch supporters, the monetization thing, and he did things that, for some people, they love that, right? Try to keep things honest, and other people had mattresses full of 500 rupee notes that overnight became nothing, right? So it's just that we can't even satisfy our own senses, right? Right? It comes and goes. So what to speak of the promises that a politician makes? And also, what is that in the Bhagavad Gita? Nimitani vyapar. Yes, so it means you get the opposite result, right? So even things that we think, even if a politician promises something and he delivers on it, right, it may have the opposite effect, isn't it? Right? And generally speaking, pretty much any policy, some people will like and some people won't like, right? Isn't it? Right? Let's say he gets really, really strict on, what is it, H-1B1 visas? It's because of immigration, right? But then our congregation is like, right, because some of us may be on such visas, right? So this or that, it's just, and especially in Kali Yuga, it's just kalo dosha nide rajan. So kalo, we know what that means, Kali Yuga. Kalo dosha means not what you made for me last night, what not prasadam, dosha. False, right? And nidhe, kalo dosha nidhe, ocean, right? So it's an ocean of South Indian dosas. No, it's not like that. It's an ocean of, Mataji makes very good dosas, but, and nice chutney also, coconut chutney. Yeah, so it's bound to disappoint. Is that okay? Does that answer your question? Yeah, it's almost impossible to satisfy. Just like ask our temple president. Sorry, my computer tells me every half hour what it is. Right? Is it easy to just satisfy everyone in the congregation? Mataji? Right. It's so hard. It's so hard. Yeah. You have a play, and you elect the people the children to be in the play, and then one parent's upset because their child didn't get the lead role. Right? Even something nice like Nishingadev drama, and somebody's going to be upset. It's just a kalodoshini devacha. And therefore, asti hieka mahagna. There's only one good thing. Kirtanadeva Krishnasya. So so the best thing is to just have kirtan all the time. Yes, Prabhu. Must always. Yeah, he's just, like I said, sometimes he speaks and he writes in hyperbole and very, but because he's making a strong point, and he's just saying that it happened, it's inevitable. Yeah, that's the point. It's practically, unless you're, and even in of course it's a lila, but even in Ayodhya with Lord Ram, right, when he found some people who were criticized, right? So let's speak of present-day politicians. Yeah. It's a challenging service. It's a challenging service to be a leader. It's a challenging service to be a temple president. I know I'm married to one. It's not an easy thing to do, but it is an important thing to do if one wants for service to Krishna. So just like Tulsi Gabbard is running for president, now it's not very likely that she's going to win this time around, at least, right? But I think she probably has better intentions than most, right? Because she's a devotee. So before this, if you look at the first sentence, so again, talking about hyperbole, the completely bewildered, right? So I thought that was an important, because most of us, I'm guessing, most of us here work in the world, and therefore we're kind of part of the world. We go to work, we associate with people who may not be devotees of Krishna. We may sometimes, check out the news, whether it's, Fox News or MSNBC or somewhere in the middle of those. And we can get, it's just like, what do they say, that a fish isn't even aware that they're surrounded by water, right? Right? So we sometimes can get so kind of surrounded by this completely bewildered material civilization, right? In the early days of ISKCON, it was a lot, oh, no problem. I thought maybe Krishna was sending me a message through his great devotee. He's a pujari. They're the connection, right? If you ever get like you go to Krishna, and whenever you go to Krishna Balaram Mandir and you're there, and the pujari offers you a tulsi leaf, you just, right? It's coming from, you really feel like Krishna made it. So if a pujari, Radha Madhava, is that the name, right? Yeah. So Radha Madhava's pujari pulls the plug. It's as good as Radharani pulling the plug, right? So the completely bewildered material civilization. So so Prabhupada is often trying to, So in the older days, I can remember living in Vrindavan. I could go, 10 months without knowing anything what's happening in the world. Zero, because I didn't read Hindi, and the newspapers were in Hindi, right? And I didn't listen to the radio or anything, BBC or something. I just had no idea. I didn't know who the president of the United States. I didn't know anything, and it was blissful, actually. I'm not saying we should go back to such, but there was such a detachment, of just, being in a completely different bubble, right? Or even as a brahmachari, the only reason I would look at a newspaper would be to, because there wasn't the internet in those days, would be to, find out what events were going on in order to distribute books at those events, right? And so it was a little easier when you read something like, the completely bewildered materials. It was, something way out there, right? But now, for most of us, we're to some extent, at least, part of it. To some extent, depending on each is individual. Just like Prabhuji says that he doesn't, he takes his prasadam separately than his coworkers. So that's, but others may feel, no, they have to, you get invited out to a business lunch, you can't say no, things like that. It depends on, your workplace. And I get invited, so I always have, salad with olive oil dressing and that, but Prabhupada is, helping us keep some understanding of what the world is like, where he says that, the completely bewildered material civilization is wrongly directed towards the fulfillment of desires and sense gratification. And so let's continue. Even those who are on the path of salvation desire to become one with the absolute truth and desire to commit spiritual suicide for sense gratification. Because, the biggest sense gratification it's small time to have a, what's that called? God, I just forget the name of that really nice electric car. Tesla, yeah. So it's one thing to want a Tesla and a big mansion and this and that. But it's another thing to become God. That's big time sense gratification, right? Big time sense gratification. But the Bhagavatam says that one should not live for sense gratification. One should satisfy the senses only in so much as required for self-preservation and not for sense gratification. Because the body is made of senses, right? When you think about it, what are the 10 senses? Hands, eyes, ears, mouth, nose, touch, sense of touch, place of evacuation, genitals, legs. And, yeah. So when you think about it, we don't usually wake up in the morning, look in the mirror and say, this is a bag of senses. Right? But actually that's the fact, isn't it? Isn't it? That's really what it is. It's a bag of senses. Yeah. When you build your new temple, spend $30 on a new microphone stand. Yeah, and it's interesting that's it's a very different way of looking at anyone's body, our body, because the body is made of senses, which also require a certain amount of satisfaction. There are regulative directions for satisfaction of the senses, but the senses are not meant for unrestricted enjoyment. Right? So we, so Prabhupada would always talk about. So we, instead of smelling some awful thing, right? We smell the incense offered to the Lord, or the flowers offered to the Lord, right? And instead of seeing whatever, we see Radha Madhava, right? And instead of hearing whatever, we hear bhajans and kirtans and glorification of Krishna. So we use all these senses, but we just don't use them. We use them in Krishna service. So then Prabhupada gives an example. Marriage, or the combination of a man and a woman, is necessary for a progeny, but it is not meant for sense enjoyment. In the absence of voluntary restraint, there's propaganda for family planning, but foolish men do not know that family planning is automatically executed as soon as there is search after the absolute truth. So, and this is the main part of this verse and the purport, right? That one should desire only a healthy life or self-preservation, since a human being, this is the main point, is meant for inquiry about the absolute truth. And nothing else should be the goal of one work. So now Prabhupada is getting to that part of the verse. Seekers of the absolute truth are never allured. What does allured mean? Attracted, yes, but it's like allured. Right? Like you're driving to the temple, but you got allured to go to that restaurant instead, or whatever, right? Right? They're having special on samosas or whatever, right? Yeah, you got, this kind of like allured has a stronger sense than just attracted, right? Almost like tricky, like Maya's trickiness, the chalu kind of thing going on. Yeah. Are never allured by unnecessary engagements in sense gratification because, now this is the real point, because the serious students seeking the absolute truth are always overwhelmed with the work of researching the truth. In every sphere of life, therefore, the ultimate end must be seeking after the absolute truth, and that sort of engagement will make one happy because he will be less engaged in varieties of sense gratification. And then the next verse explains what the absolute truth is, a very famous verse, Vedanti Tat Tatavidas. So Mataji is leaving not because she finds the class boring, but she has to go to a meeting. She told me that already. Hare Krishna. Good luck with your meeting. So this is what we could talk all day, give classes, don't engage in sense gratification. It's Maya, this and that. But really, we know from Bhagavad Gita, chapter 2, verse 59, that that's not the way it works. What's that verse? Yes, so this param dristva is really, because raso vaisaha, we are enjoyers by nature. We want to enjoy. That's just, the soul is an enjoyer by nature, because we come from Krishna, and Krishna is an enjoyer. So it's just a question of how we enjoy, right? And that higher taste of Krishna consciousness is then, it's like, I can remember especially when I first traveled in India, when I first moved there, and I would take the train and go, go second class. You know what it's like, everyone, when it's like 6 o'clock in the evening, everyone sits facing each other and they take out their tiffins and they have their, right, and they're all talking in Hindi in northern India. And for me, it was like background noise, because I didn't understand a word of it. Right? It was just like, those machines that have white noise. So it was just, I had no idea what they were talking about. It was just like background noise. It didn't make any sense to me. So similarly, when we're really strong in our Krishna consciousness, sense gratification just doesn't make any sense to us. Like, why would someone want to do that? Right? But if we're not in good consciousness, then that same thing can seem attractive to us, depending on how our consciousness and the level of our param dristva, our higher taste. Right? So here it's saying that we should, always, this is now again, Prabhupada's really speaking so strongly, always overwhelmed with the work of researching the truth. Always overwhelmed. So it's easy to get distracted from being always overwhelmed, right? Because Prabhupada writes, right, the same is applicable in all other fields. No one is serious about the problems of life, right? Because we read, we go to a class like this, or we read the Bhagavatam at home, and we say, wow, I don't want to get distracted. The goal of life is Krishna consciousness. And then, we check out CNN or something, and then we just like, huh? And we forget. So we have to, Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya, we have to regularly hear the philosophy of Krishna consciousness, because we so easily forget. So we hear about Krishna, boing, hear about Krishna, boing. And hopefully every time it's a little less this side, right? Or Prabhupada gives the example of having a glass of ink, right, and pouring milk into it, right? And slowly it goes from pitch black to dark to lighter shade, gray, a lighter shade of gray, until finally it's white, right? So we have to, pour in that hearing and chanting, because it's so easy to get distracted. Anyone ever heard of the poet T.S. Eliot? No, he was a famous American poet in the 30s. So he wrote a line that I first heard from Ravindra Suprabhu. And the line in his poem went, distracted from distractions by distractions. And he thought that the biggest distraction in the world was newspapers, because that's what they would get in the 1930s. You get a newspaper, right? And he just said, you're doing whatever you do in your life, and then you get this newspaper, and you'll get transformed into another. So what to speak of us and cell phones? Right? It's inconceivable the power, the distracting power of a phone, right? Just like who has a phone that's connected right now? Okay, so Mataji, tell me the population of East Timor. You have 1 minute. East Timor, Timor. Let's see if you can do it. A silly thing like that, you can find out in a second. Can you imagine what T.S. Eliot would have had to done in the 1930s to find out that information? Right? would have been he would have to go to a library, and that was probably outdated, and right. But here it's probably like, two children that were just born now show up there, or whatever. But you know what I mean, right? And if we asked you the cricket scores of such and such, you could find that in a second. You can find out anything, any unnecessary information in a matter of seconds. That probably took about 20 seconds, right, to find out the population of these people, right? So it's so easy to get distracted, right? And you know what it's like. You're looking at CNN.com or whatever it is. You go to the bottom and they say, the 20 best cities to retire in. So that's interesting. And you click on that, right? And 1 hour later, you've been spacing out, right? So it's so easy to get distracted. So it takes actually a greater determination than and what to speak of, like I was saying, living in Vrindavan. And I was there most of the time. I remember the first time you could actually look at a website page. Right, so there was what to speak of the 6 Goswamis they didn't have. No, but even then, right? You've been to Raghava Pandit's cave in Govardhan? No, I went inside one time, but you've seen it. It's near Rasastali, near Punchari, right? So this is 500 years ago. No newspapers, right? No telephone, no what to speak of internet, nada. But he would chant his rounds in the cave because he didn't want to get distracted. He said there were so many people just talking gossip. So compare him to us. Maybe we can make our houses like a cave or something. But it's so easy to get distracted. It's so easy to get distracted, right? And therefore, like there's this nice. But we can use things in Krishna service. It's like by Sheshika Prabhu and his community, they have that app, Be a Sage, page by page, right? So if you read 41 pages a day, which takes about an hour, you'll finish the Bhagavatam in 1 year. And if you can't do that, if you do, it'll tell you however many pages you can read a day. It'll tell you how long it'll take to read whatever book, Bhagavatam, Chaitanya Char. So sometimes it's helpful like that to inspire us, because here it says that the word researching, right, that are overwhelmed with the work of researching the absolute truth. So what does that researching mean to us? No, it's okay, it's all right. What does that researching mean to us? What should our day look like if we are to be researchers, like Prabhupada is saying here, right? He says that we don't have time for unnecessary engagements because we are overwhelmed with the work of researching the truth. So considering the fact that we have jobs or we're taking care of children, what would researching look like? So let's say we have a family and we have children, what do our vacations look like for researchers? What about our eating? What about our sleeping? What about our schedule? What about our priorities? What do we do during our commute? Right? What do we do on our weekends? So in other words, it's always helpful to take the statements that in the Bhagavatam and the statements of Srila Prabhupada and then see how can we practically apply them. And it doesn't have to be done in a fanatical way, right? It's not like you have a 2-year-old child and you say, sit down, Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya, right? It's an art to, especially to bringing up children as devotees. It is an art. And by the way, my wife always says that the most important thing in bringing up Krishna conscious children is for the parents to be happy in Krishna consciousness. Because Krishna consciousness is caught as much as it's taught. Right? So just when they see, even if they're, whatever they're doing, coloring or whatever, depending on their age, but they see us happy chanting our rounds, happy serving our deities, happy associating with devotees, like that, then that makes such a samskar, much more than we're going shnik shnik, but we're telling them chant, right? Because the children have this amazing radar for hypocrisy. Amazing radar. So most important thing. So, but how can we translate researching, eager to research the absolute truth with the fact that we may have an 8 to 10 hour workday? Right? And what does that mean in practical terms? So we can think about that, right? Think about our schedule. It's good to sometimes, because there's a statistic that almost 45% of our life is run by habits, things that we do every day. So sometimes it's good to go up in the helicopter and look down at how we spend our 24 hours and see, is that the best way to do it, right? Like a simple thing like if you have a commute, sometimes we say, oh, I'll listen to the news or listen to the traffic and see which way to, right? Or I could be, listening to a pravachan or a bhajan or something like that, right? So, all little things like that, we can be planning our life in such a way that we can be a researcher, even, if we're an IT specialist and have a terrible boss or whatever, right, who contacts us at 2 in the morning or things like that. So we have some time for thoughts, questions, comments. Yes, Mataji. Is this recorded or something? Oh, it's live. Okay. Uh-huh.
I was thinking and connecting it to yesterday's.
He's going to turn that back.
Connecting it to yesterday's assumptions, expectations, that thing.
Mm-hmm.
I find for myself that as much I try to kind of refrain from expectations, assumptions, and these kind of things in relationships, I end up doing that and damaging myself and others and this whole cycle. And many times I wonder what's happening. I keep going back to the same patterns, and this higher taste thing is like, I feel like sometimes that I don't know what it means to be without that. And so maybe I'm just sharing, but also I wanted to hear from you what would help me to cultivate that higher taste of not doing these kind of things and actually having a healthy Vaishnava relationship.
Well, just like there's a yama niyama, right? So there's do's and don'ts, right? So the don't is to understand the nature of the mind, chanchalahi mana Krishna, and to really try to practice. One part of self-realization is to understand the difference between us and our mind. Because generally we consider them the same, right? And so to actually watch the mind and see how it's affected by the modes of material nature, and then say, oh, it's just the mind, and just neglect it on the negative. But then the positive, I think we all know, what are the best ways to get a higher taste? What are some of the ways that you do? Reading, okay, what else? Hearing, book distribution, prasadam, best one. Doing devotional service, kirtan, right? So that we know Vaishnava Seva, serving devotees. So we know so we all know what it is, so we can do those, and especially do them in the right consciousness. And then it's kind of that same thing, that it's, we're so absorbed in that these other things, they very naturally fall into place, right? Just like I was thinking of this. So, and also just understanding, why don't I make positive assumptions? Right? Right? So, like, if you, like I'm staying in Prabhuji and Machiji's house, right? So let's say at 12 o'clock they hear me moving around. So they could be saying, he's in so much Maya, he's still awake, it's 12 o'clock at night. Right? You could be making a negative assumption. Or think, wow, he's so spiritual, he's up at 12 o'clock chanting his, probably he's reading the Bhagavatam or something. Right? So the same, you can make negative, it wasn't up at 12 o'clock, but you can make, the mind you can make positive or negative assumptions about Vaishnavas. So in general, it's good to assume positive intentions when we're, especially in a community. That doesn't mean to be naive, right? Like if somebody comes and they break open the hundi and steal money from it, right? Because that's funny. Let's say they steal money, and then they come back a few months later. They're so apologetic. I'm so sorry. They return the money and they say, please give me some service. So we might give them some service. We probably won't make them the treasurer. Right? So, it doesn't mean, to not make, to make positive assumptions about people, or to assume positive intent doesn't mean to be naive, right? Prabhupada wasn't happy with his Western devotees who were naive and getting cheated so much when they were building the Krishna Balaram Mandir, right? And, yes. So, but to actually, make a conscious effort. It's just like anything else. Remember, we had those 4 steps? So it's just making a conscious effort that I'm going to assume positive intent when I'm, if someone cuts in line on prasadam, we think they're probably in a big rush to get back to their aging mother or something like that, instead of saying, back of the line, get out of here, right? You know what I mean? Like that. Is that all right? Yes, Prabhu. First what?
First visit.
Acha?
Yeah, I'm the new.
Welcome.
I came from Detroit.
Did you? Where do you live in Detroit? Farmington Hills?
Farmington, yes.
I have, you see how devotees have ESP? No. I lived in Detroit for 10 years, and I know that a lot of our congregation members live in Farmington. We have a temple in Novi. In Farmington Hills itself. Yes.
Yeah, last year it started.
Yeah.
So yeah, I came today to visit my parents. So they are coming from India.
Acha.
So I came to Naperville. So just I googled it. So ISKCON Naperville is nearby. So I thought I will visit.
Very nice.
I came. So I saw the class, Bhagavatam class. It was very wonderful.
Thank you for coming. Where do your parents live in India?
Hyderabad.
Hyderabad Pakka or Secunderabad or Hyderabad?
Hyderabad.
I spent a lot of time in Hyderabad. So, yes, nice place.
So, Prabhuji, I was having one question. Basically, sense gratification.
Yes.
So, when we start sense gratification, once we get the taste, then we will go into deep. For example, watching with eyes. When we started watching, we look right. Our distraction will be good or bad side. So if the good side is good, then definitely our mind is always opposite to the good side. We always do bad.
Right. But you watch Tollywood movies, not Bollywood movies, right?
So my question was how to control, I want to hear from you.
Well, in addition to what we've already said, right, because we already said some things, even answering Mataji's question. In addition to that, perhaps one of the best ways is association, right? There's a saying in Portuguese that tell me who you associate with, I'll tell you who you are, right? And also in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, maybe some of you know the verse, I can't remember the Bengali, but it says that the root cause of bhakti is association. Anyone? Janma Bula? Anyway, so when we see someone who really has a higher taste by practicing Krishna consciousness, it gives us faith. Because we need some faith to make that jump away from Tollywood movies to seeing the beautiful form of the deities and whatever. And that leap of faith to actually say, yes, it can be done, is usually when we see an example, or many examples. And that's the benefit of the association of devotees. And even if in our community there's not like a Mahabhagavats, these great, Prabhupads or Ramapad Swamis or whatever, on a daily basis, just the fact that we're all trying together, and we're also, associating with Prabhupada by his books and by his lectures and other great devotees, that can be a big inspiration that, yes, it can be done. It's like one time, Srila Prabhupada was in New Vrindavan, and this is quite early, and they gave him this, have you ever anyone heard of those sweets called Simply Wonderfuls? They're very simple, right? They're just, what's in them? Milk powder, butter, lots of sugar, and sometimes raisins or something like that, right? Yeah. And so they gave Prabhupada one of them, and Prabhupada said, oh, that's how the name came about. He said, oh, this is simply wonderful. And then one of the devotees said, Prabhupada, you are simply wonderful. And then underneath are we time? Okay. And then underneath his breath, Prabhupada said, you all become. So in other words, this is not outside of our reach, being a great devotee, because that's actually who we are. That's our janmakar, that's our birthright, to be a lover of God. And so it's not easy. No one said it's easy, because we have conditioning in this life, we have all these purva samskars from previous lives. But if we can also find some Vaishnava or Vaishnavi who we can reveal our minds to and say, yes, I have this problem, I have this attraction, that lifts a big burden from us, if we can trust that person not to go on Facebook and tell the world afterwards, right? And then we can work with that devotee or other devotees to overcome our shortcomings and get attracted to Krishna consciousness. Is that all right? I think it's time. Yes. Hare Krishna. All glories to Srila Prabhupada.